All right, here's the next section we're going to build. Now in this section, we have this repetitive pattern. We have a 2-column grid with some content on one side and an image on the other side. Here's another instance of this pattern. So to build this section, first we're going to build this pattern or this component. Then we're going to combine all these components together and add the heading and some paragraph on the top to build the entire block or the entire section. So in this lesson, we just want to focus on this part. I'm going to call this a feature component. Now, once again, I believe you have all the necessary skills to build this component on your own. So spend 10 minutes on this and then come back see my solution. So we're going to build a feature component. Now, what HTML element should we use to represent each feature? We can certainly use a div, but a more semantic choice is the article element. So we talked about this in the first part of this series. I told you that with the article element, we can represent any independent, self-contained piece of content. So back to our design mockup, each of these features is an independent, self-contained piece of content, right? So we have an article. Now, this article is essentially a 2-column grid. So here we're going to add 2 classes, grid and grid 1x2. Now, in the first column, we're going to have a few items, an icon, a heading, a paragraph, and a link. We should wrap all of these elements inside a container. So that container is going to be the first item in our grid. So we're going to add a div. Now, inside this div, we need an icon. So let's bring up the template for our icons. I'm going to copy all of this code and then paste it right here. Now, below the icon, we need a heading. What kind of heading element do we use here? Well, back to our design, here we have an H2 element. So the next heading we should use is H3. So we add an H3 and say, super easy to use. Then we add a paragraph with some text, followed by a link. So earlier we built a link component that gives us this kind of look. So we're going to add an anchor with a class of link dash arrow. For the href attribute, I'm just going to use a pound. And here we're going to say learn more. Let's see what we get up to this point. Here's the mobile version. Now there's so much space between the icon and the heading. And this comes from the top margin of the heading. But I don't want to remove the top margin from all H3 elements because somewhere else we might have multiple paragraphs separated by H3 elements. So we want to have the top margin to separate this section from previous sections, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to give this a class like feature _heading. And in the future, we can always change the type of this element from H3 to something else, okay? Now, let's define a new section called features. Here we're going to add a rule for our headings and set the margin to 1 rem vertical and 0 horizontal. So here's what we get. That looks pretty good. Now, what about the padding around the content? The content is currently so close to the edges of the screen. Well, we can apply some padding to the feature component, but in this case, I don't want to apply a padding because eventually we're going to put this inside a block and the block will apply some horizontal padding. So for now, I don't want to worry about this, okay? So here in the mobile version, we have built this part and this looks very similar to what we have built here. Great. Now we need to add an image. So back to our markup, after the div that wraps all the content of this feature, we're going to add an image. Now back to the images folder, look at this file, easy.jpg. The size of this file is over 200 kilobytes. We can optimize this file using the same strategy we talked about earlier. So on laptops and desktops, this image is going to take up half of our container, so it's going to be a maximum of 570 pixels. Now on mobiles, the image is going to stretch to take up all the available space. Now once again, the width of most, if not all mobile devices is under 500 pixels. So again, we're going to pick 570 as the base size for this image. Then we're going to supply an additional version for 2x screens. Now, because these steps are repetitive, I'm going to pause the recording. I'm going to resize the image in Photoshop and then convert it to WebP using cloudconvert.com. So here's the end result. For a standard density screens, we have a JPEG, which is 33 kilobytes, and a WebP, which is 14 kilobytes, far better than 200 kilobytes. For high density screens, we have a JPEG that is 57 kilobytes and a WebP that is 28 kilobytes. So let's add all of these files to our project. Good. Now, back to our markup. We're going to wrap this image with a picture element. So we wrap it with a picture. Good. Now we add the sources. So here's the first source. We set the type to image/webp and source set to images/easy.webp for 1x screens and images/easy at 2x.webp for 2x screens. Good. Now let's duplicate this element and change the image type to JPG. I'm also going to change the file extensions in one go. So JPG. Good. Now, as I told you before, we should always add the image element. And here we're going to use the high quality JPEG. So that is images/easy at 2x.jpg. So if the browser doesn't support the WebP format, we're going to give it a high quality JPEG. Back to the browser. So here's our image. It's currently so close to our content div, so we need to apply a gap. Back to our markup. Here's our article. We're going to give it an extra class called feature. So once again, look, I'm organizing these classes in a logical manner. So first we start with more generic classes, then we add more specific classes. This way, our code has a nice organization. Now, back to our style sheet, we define a new rule for our features and give them a gap of 4 rems. Good. Take a look. I think that looks better. Now, what about the tablet and desktop version? So I think everything looks great. On tablets and desktops, I think 4 rems of gap is too much. So back to this rule, we're going to use 4 rems of gap for rows and 2 rems for columns. That's better. Now let's pull up Chrome DevTools. Here on the network tab, let's make sure we're getting the right image. So I'm getting easy at 2x.webp. This verifies that our implementation of the picture element is correct. Now back to the browser. Let's make the browser smaller. So for mobile, I believe I forgot something. Look, our image is not responsive. So it's not responding to the changes in the size of the viewport. So back to our markup, here's the picture element and our image is right here. We're going to give it a class and call this feature _image. Then we define a rule and say all the images that we have here should have a width of 100%. Now the image is responsive. Great. Perfect. So we have built the feature component. Now we need to add a few features and wrap them inside a block. The first thing I want to do is to change this icon. That is for WordPress. We have to change this to easy. So back to our markup. This is where we're using the icon. I'm going to change this to easy. Let's make sure it works. Great. So now we need to add a section and give it 2 classes, block and container. Then we're going to move this article inside the section element. So let's grab it and move it right here. Good. Then I'm going to duplicate this a few times and change the labels and icons so they match what we have in our design mockup. Because this is going to be repetitive, I'm going to pause the recording. All right, our section is almost ready. So we have all these features, but there are a couple of problems here. The first problem is the vertical margin between these features. So back to our style sheet, we're going to give each feature a vertical margin of, let's say, 12 rems. So that solves the problem. Great. Now the second problem is the order of these items. Look at our design mockup. The order of the content and the image are changing in alternating rows. How can we implement this? Very easy. Back to our feature. This is the div that wraps our content. I'm going to give this a class, let's say feature _content. Now I'm going to apply the same class to other features. So I'm going to pause the recording and come back in a second. Back to our style sheet. Here we're going to write a media query for screens that are wider than 768 pixels. Here we're going to define a rule and target every second feature. How can we do that? Using pseudo class selectors. So we're going to grab features and then select those with nth of type even. So with this, we're going to select the second, the fourth, the sixth feature, and so on. Then we're going to target feature content. And here we're going to swap the order and set it to 2. So by default, The order of the content is 1 because in our markup, we have added the content first and then the image. So now by setting the order of the content to 2, the image will take up the position of the first item in the grid. So this is a simple way to solve this problem. Another way is to manually change the order of the content and the image in alternating rows. I don't favor that approach because we might make a mistake. So back to the browser. Now take a look. That's exactly like our design mockup. Beautiful. So the last thing we want to add to this section is the heading and the paragraph on the top. So back to the section element. First, we're going to add a header and give it the class of block _header. Here we're going to have an h2 and say host on the cloud to keep growing. And then we add a paragraph with 10 words. Good. That is the final result. It looks very nice and polished. The only problem I see is the space between the first item and the paragraph. Look at our design mockup. The space here is less. So back to our style sheet. Once again, we can use pseudo class selectors to target the first feature. So we want to grab the first feature. So we say first of type and overwrite the top margin. So margin top, we're going to set it to 6 rems. That is half the margin we assigned over here. Now take a look. All right, that's much better. So we're done with this section. Let's move on to the next lesson.